We have with us, of course, the Army Chief. He needs no introduction. Army Chief, I know before we get into our interaction, you want to say a few words on the emerging security situation around the world and also, of course, in our neighborhood. I'd invite you to begin with your introductory comments.
Well, thank you very much for having me here to share my thoughts, and I would like to also thank Mr. M.K. Anand, the MD and CEO of the Times Network, for giving me this opportunity to share my views with you all. A very eminent audience comprising, I think, ministers, policymakers, captains of the industry, entrepreneurs, and each and every one of you, very eminent personalities in your respective fields. And I must confess that I feel a tad nervous because this is the first time I'm speaking in front of my wife.
Welcome, Madam Narbane. Welcome.
Coming on to the subject at hand, and that is the national security, I would just like to touch on a few issues. When we think of national security, we should see it in a very wholesome manner, and it includes the external threats and challenges as well as the internal challenges that we have. The external threats, of course, we are taking care of in maintaining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country and making sure that nobody can impose his will on us. But then security also has many other dimensions. It includes energy security, food security, social security, and in this era of the COVID pandemic, even health security. If you don't have a healthy population, you cannot say that your nation is secure. And therefore, there is no doubt that we need to have a very safe and secure environment if we want to prosper as a nation. And it is the responsibility of the state, of the government of the day, to make that security possible. And of that, I think there is no doubt in anybody's mind. But sometimes what comes up for debate is how much should we spend on this security? The guns versus butter debate. And many feel that our expenditure on security is a waste of the taxpayers' money and a sunk cost. But that's one view. I would like to give a different view. That whatever we spend on security is actually an investment, and an investment on which you get good returns, both tangible and intangible. You just have to see that whenever there is tension, what happens to the share market. Even the other day, when the surge in the COVID cases took place, when even other countries put in fresh measures, a slew of measures and lockdowns, it immediately had an impact on the share market, stock market. So security has these wider dimensions. And therefore, I feel that whatever you spend on security is actually an investment. And to carry this theme forward, I will show you how actually you get a return. Because when you invest in defense, when we sign our contracts, we have recently signed a contract with Bharat Dynamics for anti-tank guided missiles for over 1,100 crore, with Mahindra and Mahindra for light strike vehicles, again more than 1,000 crore. In fact, over the last year, we have signed contracts worth 14,000 crores, of which 80% in keeping with the call for Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat have been to Indian companies. That is more than 11,000 crores worth is with Indian companies. And where does this money go? It goes obviously to these firms, but it goes to sustain an ecosystem of its own. Those people who are producing and providing the raw material, who are giving the components, the assemblies and the sub-assemblies which go up to make the larger platform. It goes to the wages of the workers. It goes as dividend to the shareholders. So all this money actually gets plowed back into the economy. And I think that is why it is actually sustaining our growth. It is contributing to growth. It is contributing to the GDP. Similarly, on the revenue side, pay allowances, the operating and maintenance expenses, all that goes back into the local economy. Wherever an army unit is stationed, they contribute to the local economy, to the traders, to the artisans, to the vegetable vendor, to the milkman. All the pay allowances, actually it is going into roti, kapda, makan. So it should not be seen as a sunk cost, which many sometimes feel that allocations on defense is just money wasted. And in fact, you have to be surprised to know that whenever we talk about moving a unit out from somewhere, we immediately get hundreds of representations from ministers, from the governors, from the chief ministers. It even becomes a parliament question that why are you moving so and so out? Why? Because everyone knows how much we contribute to the local community. A simple ballpark, back of the envelope figure, for every 1,000 people stationed at a place, I think they contribute about 50 lakhs a month locally. That is the kind of investment that there is. So I think we should not be seeing national security from a very myopic viewpoint. And I would say that any allocations for defense are actually a catalyst for growth. But in this larger construct, as far as security of our external borders is concerned, the northern border, we had some tensions in eastern Ladakh. We had a number of rounds of talks, and post the 9th round of talks, we were able to reach an agreement, and the disengagement of the forces started on the 10th of February, and it proceeded in the phased manner as agreed upon. Similarly, on the western border with Pakistan, the Director Generals of Military Operation of both the countries issued a joint statement on 25th Feb, agreeing to resuscitate the ceasefire understanding of 2003, which was being honored more in the breach. And I'm glad to inform that the whole month of March, we have had not a single shot being fired on the LC, barring an odd incident. It is for the first time in about 5 or 6 years that the LC has been silent. And
that's very good news. That's fantastic news.
And that really bodes well for the future. And I'm sure that with the peace and tranquility prevailing on the borders, it will, in its own way, contribute to the development and the growth of the rest of the country. So February has indeed been a good month for us. And to conclude, I would just like to say that the Indian Army is India's army. It is an army of the people, for the people. And when we stand guard on our borders, we do so with the full confidence that we have the trust and love and affection of the people of India, and your army will never let you down. Thank you.
Those are laudable sentiments, of course, and we all share them with you, General Saab. Since you brought up the border with Pakistan in that region and the fact that there's been no ceasefire violations, what has actually brought on this rapprochement from the Pakistani side? I'll begin with that question. What prompted this move for Pakistan to suddenly reach across and say, we're ready to shake hands, let bygones be bygones, and let's go back to the ceasefire arrangement?
I said that we've been having these duels across the line of control for a long time, but those duels were not actually achieving any worthwhile result, or it was not resulting in any forward movement of any kind. I also feel that they have their own problems internally, and from time to time you have to also see whether a strategy that you're following is actually paying any dividends. Over so many years, I think they would have also realized that it is time to make a change, and that would have prompted them to extend this olive branch. However, the terrorist infrastructure still remains intact across the border. The launch pads still exist, the infrastructure still exists, the terrorists are still there. There has been no reduction in that. So it is too early to say as yet whether this will
General
hold.
Saab, what you're saying is that instead of this being a genuine desire for peace on the part of the Pakistanis, it might be born out of a compulsion. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's quite possible, but as I say, we'll have to wait and see. Once the snows melt and the passes open, if the situation still remains normal, then there is a good prognosis for the future, but we'll have to wait and watch.
So let me just explore this. If it is a compulsion, what could be the top 3 compulsions that are pushing Pakistan in this direction?
Well, I think one is, of course, the situation on their western border with Afghanistan. Things are not very rosy there as far as they're concerned. That could be one. The second is, of course, the threat of the FATF, which hangs over their head. They're still in the grey list. Probably they would like to show that they are making some efforts towards not supporting terrorism and getting out of that grey list. And third, of course, is their domestic compulsions.
So I want to ask you this because obviously we are beginning to see a thaw in also other areas. Diplomatically, we've gone back, resumed the Indus Water dialogue with Pakistan. The emphasis on the statements that have come out are on core issues, their core issues, and obviously India has its own core issues. What are Pakistan's core issues in the context of the agreement that has been reached between your force and their force, and do they extend also to Kashmir?
Well, you see, the agreement between the DGMOs is more at the military level. We have not really talked of at our level of other factors which you have just alluded to. So I would not be in a position to say really what their core issues would be. But as far as we are concerned, our core issue is that they have to stop support to terrorism, and unless they stop that, it cannot be business as usual.
But you're saying that the terror infrastructure hasn't actually been dismantled on their side.
That has not gone.
That has not happened.
So that is the core issue as far as we are concerned.
So all of those launch pads that we have reported over the last 1.5, 2 years, especially around the Uri incident and a little after, they remain in place.
Quite right. They remain in place, and we have detailed intelligence of each of those camps, the locations, the likely strength of terrorists awaiting or who have undergone training and are present there, perhaps waiting for an opportunity to cross over. So we'll have to, as I said, wait and watch.
It's good to, of course, wait and watch, but would you concede that you're optimistic or not at all optimistic about this ceasefire holding?
No, I would say we are very optimistic, especially with the comments which have been made recently. And a very important point to note is that this agreement is between the DGMOs of both sides. So obviously the Pakistan army is on board. And if the Pakistani army is on board, then there is every reason to be quite optimistic of the outcome.
But it's not as if the Pakistani state has been divorced really from the army, even in the past. When we've seen big breakthroughs, we've seen accords signed it always comes back to square one. And in the context of the statements that you're referring to, the army chief there, General Qamar Bajwa, said recently that the two countries need to bury the past and move forward. But you're admitting that the Pakistanis haven't done very much to convince us that their intentions are noble. They haven't even dismantled the terror infrastructure. So why do you believe this time that there is a reason for you to be optimistic, let alone anyone else?
One reason, of course, is that the ceasefire has held for so long and there's been no firing. There have been no attempts to infiltrate, because normally the firing which used to happen would happen when terrorists were trying to infiltrate, and they would be giving the covering fire to assist in that infiltration. So there's been no firing. Obviously, there's been no infiltration. So that gives a cause for being reasonably optimistic about the future.
General Saab, let me ask you this, and I'm going to be a little blunt with you. Why are we rewarding Pakistan's notoriety? We've pushed them diplomatically and militarily into a corner. Suddenly they come up, and for reasons less genuine, with this ceasefire offer, and you have your counterpart making conciliatory statements. But when we've beaten them into a corner, why are we giving them elbow room once again to perhaps even recoup and re-begin what they are best at doing?
No, we have to keep trying various strategies. If something is not working, then you cannot keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So you have to keep trying different things.
How does the Indian Army Chief, who talks about the sacrifices, as you have done, of the army in the recent past, square this decision to go back to the talks table when we actually haven't seen any movement forward on the Pakistanis delivering on the plotters of 26/11, Uri, Pulwama? Are we not trying to sort of, at some level, trivialize the sacrifices of our martyrs itself by sort of being conciliatory in return?
No, I think, as I said, we have to try new things all the time. So we have had this ceasefire. Let's see how it works out. If it works out, it will lead to more steps and more doors opening. So this is just the first step out of possibly a number of steps in that direction towards normalizing the relations between the two countries.
So what are the 2 or 3 steps that you're expecting Pakistan to take now as we move forward? Fine, we've decided to open a new chapter. But what are the 3 or 4 steps that you think that if they take those, they're serious in the medium term about this ceasefire and about their intentions?
One, of course, to uphold the ceasefire. Second is some reduction or dismantling of the terror camps take place. That would be a major outcome. And it is not only restricted to the terror camps or the LC region, but there is also a lot of drone activity and dropping of weapons and arms and ammunition through the use of drones, even in Punjab. Even that has to stop. So at a military level, unless all these activities see some reduction, we don't think it will move very much forward, but we are hopeful.
Well, let's talk a little bit about our side of the LOC and IB. Let's focus a little bit on Kashmir for a few moments. 370, the abrogation took place. We're seeing a normalization in Kashmir. We've seen elections there at the DDC level. How do you characterize the situation there on the ground? Has Article 370 been transformative?
Yes, it has certainly had a lot of effect on the ground. And when I say this, I do not say this just because I have to make such a statement, but I state objectively based on statistics. Statistics of the number of terrorist incidents that have taken place, the number of stone pelting incidents, the casualties suffered both by the other security forces and the army. So by virtue of quantified figures, we can definitely say that there has been a lot of improvement in the ground situation. And as is borne out by the fact that tourism, even in winter, was at an all-time high. Just about 3-4 days ago, one of my friends from the valley had come, and he told me that a room in Gulmarg, which was normally available for 2,000 rupees, is going for 15,000 rupees. That is the kind of normalcy which has come in.
So, radicalization, however, does remain a concern for you. We have seen, of course, efforts. The army has carried out certain de-radicalization camps. We've seen that with the government actively now getting into the process and holding meetings with stakeholders, religious stakeholders, to de-emphasize the message of radicalization. But it is a concern. And would you say today that militancy or terrorism in the state of Jammu and Kashmir now has a definitive ideological, religious imprint to it?
Well, let me just right at the outset clarify one point, that we do not have any de-radicalization camps of any kind. So I don't think we should get with that impression that we are herding any local people together in some camp somewhere and trying to brainwash them. It's nothing like that is happening on the ground. But yes, the youth are prone to join the militant ranks for various reasons, including, it is a very romantic kind of a thing to hold a gun and take your photo and put it out on the social media. So that remains a concern as far as we are, when we are formulating our strategies and towards winning the hearts and minds of the population. And we have a number of programs in place to wean the youth away from this gun culture, including giving them training, opening up avenues for their education outside the state of J&K, employment opportunities, and so on and so forth. So that, again, when I say if you have your basic needs are being met, then nobody will join the ranks of the militants. And that is where now the focus of the entire effort has to be, not just from the army, but as a government as a whole.
But as I said, is there a definitive religious design now to the problem, so to speak, in Kashmir?
No, the radicalization does have a religious slant to it, but not as much as people would like to believe. I think the people of J&K know what is good for them, and they also, under the shadow of the gun, are sometimes forced into a particular direction or forced to make certain statements, because as security forces we cannot be everywhere and all the time. Plus, whereas we have to follow the laws of the land, the terrorist does not. And therefore his power to coerce and extract a particular kind of behavior from the population will always be slightly more. But I do not think that they're getting radicalized to that extent.
Let's look at the entire scenario now from the Eastern perspective. Let's focus a little bit on China. General Narawane, after 9 rounds of talks, India and China have managed to reach de-escalation, you referred to it, in the north and south banks of the Pangong Tso. Can you take us through how this was achieved? Was this because of the insurmountable pressure that you have applied, not just, of course, militarily, but holistically, diplomatically? But I want you to focus really on the military aspect of this.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have, after the rounds of talks, succeeded in getting some agreement on the disengagement of the troops, that is, the troops which were face-to-face with each other and which could have led to some misunderstandings and flare-ups. So now they're not face-to-face, but have disengaged and gone back to the agreed positions. But the strength in these rear areas remains what it was, even at the height of the tensions. So as I say that the threat has only abated, it has not gone away altogether. And unless a substantial amount of de-escalation takes place, that is, all the troops who had come in from the other regions or from their permanent garrisons are now within striking distance of the border, if you would put it that way. Unless all these elements and the capability that he has built up unless these elements also go back, we would not really be able to say that things are back to normal. But when we were over this period of 8-9 months, when we were negotiating with the Chinese, it was just not a thing at the military level. We did our part, but it was also at the political level, where the respective defense ministers spoke to each other, the foreign ministers spoke to each other, and that is where the guiding principles had been laid down and very clearly enunciated by our political leadership, that it has to be status quo of April 2020. And that remained the bottom line in all our negotiations.
So let me ask you some particular questions. Does India have access to all areas it had access to before April 2020, sir?
Now, some areas still remain under discussion. I won't say that we do not have occupation of those areas, but that will be the focus of our talks in the next round of discussions that take place in the
So we don't have access right now
10th
to all
round,
the
11th
areas.
round. No, there are some areas which still remain to be negotiated.
Is India able to patrol all the areas that it had access to before April 2020?
No, as I mentioned, there are some areas which we still have to negotiate. But in the overall scheme of things, I feel that we have very strong grounds to believe that we will be able to achieve all our aims.
So let me ask you this. Are the Chinese still sitting on territory that was in India's control before April 2020, sir?
No, that would be an incorrect statement. There are areas which are under nobody's control. So where we were controlling, we are in those areas, and where they were controlling, they're in those areas.
So you're saying that it would be incorrect for us to say that the Chinese are still in control of territories that perhaps they had accessed before April 2020 or after April 2020. That's what you're saying.
No, you see, the whole issue of the LAC is because of these gray areas, because there is no demarcated line of control, line of actual control, and there are different claims and perceptions. So unless the LAC is demarcated, you cannot make the statement that I am where I am, he is where he is, he does not have more, or I don't have less. So all these questions are actually quite rhetorical unless
But there is no,
LAC
the
gets
Prime Minister
demarcated.
himself said that the Chinese are under no control of even an inch of Indian territory. You would be in agreement with that statement?
Yes, absolutely.
Let me ask you, the defense minister said it has been, and I'll quote him, it has also been agreed to have a temporary moratorium on military activities by both sides in the North Bank, including patrolling to the traditional areas. Patrolling will be resumed only when both sides reach an agreement in diplomatic and military talks that would be held subsequently. That's roughly what you're saying. So patrolling has not resumed thus far.
That's right.
So it hasn't resumed thus
Hasn't
far.
resumed, because we feel that the tensions are still running high, and when patrolling resumes, there are always chances of face-offs and inadvertent escalation of the situation. We feel that we should go step by step. Now we've done the disengagement. Let us see how that goes, and then through the talks, then we will see how to resume the patrol.
So just to be very clear on this issue, you're saying there is an no man's land area, so to speak, where the Chinese can't access and the Indians can't access right now.
That would be putting it in a correct perspective.
Okay. The defense minister also said the House should also know, and he was speaking in Parliament, that there are still some outstanding issues with regard to deployment and patrolling at some other points along the LAC in eastern Ladakh. General Narawane, could you tell us what are the developments since on these other friction points, including the Depsang Plains, among other areas?
These are the issues which we will be discussing in the future rounds of talks, and the guiding principle still remains that we need to restore the traditional rights, and that would apply to both sides. After all, it is not as if only we were doing the patrolling, so were they. So we have to reach an understanding which is mutually acceptable to both the countries.
Let me come back to a statement that you made in the context of China. How much are we really in a position to trust China? You'd been speaking about disengagement in Pangong Tso, saying it's a win-win for all of us, but we also know that the Chinese violated and breached our trust. We're creeping forward and making very small incremental changes. When you spoke about the encroachment, how do you characterize the Chinese attitude? And are you confident that they will actually come back to us in the few rounds that we are planning to hold with them and deliver what we expect?
We'll see, all agreements are based on trust, and all agreements are based on the premise that they will be followed in letter and spirit. But if you decide not to do that, then of course you have to be, why have an agreement in the first place? So we have to believe that they are serious this time and they will abide to all the clauses of this particular agreement, as also abide by the clauses of the previous agreements. And if need be, we can always renegotiate those agreements so that the incidents which took place because of not following each of them in letter and spirit, so such a situation doesn't arise again in the future. But as I mentioned, I think in one of my earlier talks that, and I had quoted actually President Ronald Reagan, that trust but verify.
It's difficult, isn't it, for you to be doing this job in such polarized times. You're not just dealing with the propaganda that comes from across the borders, both Pakistan and China, but also a large number of individuals here who constantly question the integrity of your own statements vis-a-vis the actual situation on the LAC. How do you rationalize when these statements come your way, when you read about them in the papers or watch them on channels?
No, I don't think that anybody is making any statement which goes really counter to what we feel or what we say. Everyone has a different perception and a different take, and then I think everyone is entitled to his own opinion.
A large number of opposition leaders will say that, look, we've conceded territory, which is sort of, indirectly implying that the army didn't do its job, didn't stand its ground. How do you react to that?
No, we are quietly confident of our own capabilities. We know what we have done, what we have achieved, and of course, credit for that goes entirely to the officers and men who have withstood such harsh winters in very inhospitable terrain and climate, -35, -37, with a wind chill factor. So they have done their job, and we should see the positives, the glass half full or glass half empty. I would rather see it as 3/4 full and ignore that other part.
So you're basically calling upon some of these doubters to say, look at things with a glass 3/4 full. Yeah. That's what you're saying.
That's right.
How does it feel when they don't do this, and when you know that you are absolutely honest, not just with yourself, but with this nation? It must, I'm sure it has an effect on your morale, perhaps at some level, or even your expectations. You might think
No, not at all. In the army, you learn to be thick-skinned.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful, because that's the spirit, viewers. That's the spirit which stands India in good stead. Remember this: the army takes it, the forces take it on their chest. They don't turn their back. So to all of those individuals who question constantly on a daily basis the claims of our army and the establishment that gets briefed by the army, these are the words that they need to focus on. Let me just quickly ask you, so the rising footprints of China, and this is what you said last month, in India's neighborhood and its attempts to unilaterally alter the status quo along our disputed borders have created an environment of confrontation and mutual, I suppose you're saying, interest. You've also spoken about Chinese belligerence in the Indo-Pacific and its attempt to create regional dependencies through the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you elaborate on this? Because it did lead to a lot of chatter.
Well, I suppose all of us have been following the news, and only 2 days ago, they had sent more than 200 fishing vessels. This just goes to reinforce what I had said, that they are trying to force their way, especially unilaterally force their way and change the status quo with little regard for the interests of the other neighboring countries, most of whom are very, very much smaller than them, and I would say in a way trying to bulldoze their way. And I guess that would not be acceptable to any self-respecting country. And all these countries are now realizing that they need to also take a stand and safeguard their interests.
Well, we've come together, at least certain countries that can stand up to China in this Quad initiative. We've just had a summit meeting. Would you see Quad as potentially a military alliance somewhere in the future?
The Quad is actually supposed to be a quadrilateral security dialogue. So we keep calling it the Quad, but the actual aim of that was a security dialogue. And this will, of course, have a security part of it. But in this, every country will still be looking at its own interests. So it won't be an alliance in that sense. It won't be a military alliance, but there will be definitely military cooperation, both bilateral between the countries of the Quad and as a quadrilateral also. But it won't be a military alliance as in that sense.
So it won't be a NATO.
It won't be a NATO. Yeah,
so let me ask you this, because a large number of, again, opposition leaders and defense analysts constantly say that India should not get into any binaries. The Quad cannot become a forum that is targeted against any one particular country in the region. And of course, the elephant in the room, or the dragon in the room, is China. Do you see it that way, or do you think that Quad is pretty much, in its current context, focused against the dragon in the room?
No, I don't think it is focused against any particular country. It is, as I said, it used to be a bilateral arrangement, which has now become a quadrilateral arrangement. And we will take forward all the points as required. It could be bilateral,
but the stakeholders,
it could be 3 countries at a time, it could be all 4 together. It's not necessarily that everything.
The other 3 stakeholders really wanted to become a forum, especially America, and you've seen the statements that came out even after the summit meet. You saw what the Australians were saying. They wanted to send a message straight to China. Do you think India should now move in that direction and say, okay, let's, at least for now, tell the world that the Quad will effectively negate Chinese adventurism?
No, I don't think the Quad is aimed at any particular country. I think that would be a wrong message if at all it is being viewed that way. It is an alliance of like-minded countries, like-minded democratic countries who have shared values and who believe in an international order which is based on rules and regulations. So it is a partnership of like-minded countries. It is not aimed at anybody.
And you wouldn't want it to become in the near future either?
No.
Very quickly, sir, my last question. We've been having a lot of conversations about modernizing the army in the context of the external security threats we're facing. Do you see a great disparity right now in infrastructure along the borders, all contested borders and all fractious borders? And what really are the steps that are being taken to restore balance if you do see an imbalance?
No, infrastructure development actually is a continuous process. It would, before Galwan, everybody used to keep asking that post-Doklam what has changed. It is not as if post-Doklam we suddenly started making roads. Similarly, it is not as if post-Galwan we have suddenly started infrastructure development. infrastructure development, improving of the connectivity in border areas, improving the habitat in border areas. This is a continuous and ongoing process. So we were never lagging behind in any manner.
General Narvane, it's been very pleasurable speaking with you. You've spoken like a true soldier and the defendant of the national interests along with all your forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone.